The frost bit deep into Tabitha Turner's bones as she stumbled along the mountain trail, her thin shawl doing nothing against the January wind that howled through the Sierra Nevada, passes like a wounded animal seeking vengeance. She had been foolish to trust Samuel Garrett, the traveling merchant who had promised her safe passage from Sacramento to Virginia City, where her sister lived, only to abandon her 3 days into the journey when his wagon wheel broke, and he decided she was too much of a burden to carry forward on horseback. He had left her with half a canteen of water and a stale biscuit, pointing vaguely eastward before disappearing into the tree line. That had been yesterday morning, and Tabitha had been walking ever since, her boots worn through at the soles, her fingers numb inside her thin gloves, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. The year was 1875, and winter had come early to Nevada, blanketing the higher elevations in snow that made every step a battle. Tabitha was 22 years old, a school teacher from San Francisco who had lost her position when the school board decided that unmarried women were not suitable influences for young children. Her sister Margaret had written to say there was work in Virginia City, that the mining town was flush with silver money and desperate for educated women to teach the children of newly wealthy miners. Tabitha had sold everything she owned to afford the journey, never imagining it would end like this, freezing to death on a mountain trail with no one to hear her cries for help. She fell for the 3rd time in an hour, her knees hitting the frozen ground hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. The tears froze on her cheeks almost immediately. She tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate, the muscles seizing from cold and exhaustion. This was it, she thought. This was how she would die, alone on a mountain trail, her body not discovered until spring when the snow melted, and some unfortunate traveler stumbled across her frozen remains. The sound of hoofbeats made her lift her head, hope flaring in her chest like a match struck in darkness. Through the swirling snow, she saw a horse and rider approaching, moving with purpose along the trail. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, stolen away by the wind. The rider drew closer, and Tabitha could make out more details. A tall man on a roan horse, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather. He had a rifle in a saddle holster and saddlebags that looked well stocked. As he approached, he pulled his horse to a stop, and Tabitha found herself looking up into a face that was all hard angles and weather-worn leather, with eyes the color of whiskey-catching sunlight. "Jesus Christ," the man said, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. He was at her side in 3 long strides, kneeling in the snow beside her. "How long have you been out here?" "Since yesterday," Tabitha managed through chattering teeth. "Please, I need help." The man did not hesitate. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, and the warmth that had been trapped by his body heat felt like heaven against her frozen skin. "Can you stand?" "I do not think so," she admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. "All right then." He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, and Tabitha was too cold and too grateful to protest. He carried her to his horse, a magnificent animal with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. "This is going to be awkward, but we need to get you warm. My cabin is about 5 miles south of here, down in the valley. We can make it before dark if we move now." He lifted her onto the horse first, then swung up behind her, gathering the reins in one hand while his other arm wrapped around her waist to hold her secure. The warmth of his body pressed against her back was the most wonderful thing Tabitha had ever felt. He kicked the horse into a steady trot, and they began moving down the trail. "I am Tabitha Turner," she said after a few minutes, feeling like she should introduce herself to the man who was saving her life. "Yates Ryland," he replied, his voice a deep rumble she could feel through his chest. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone in this weather?" She explained about Samuel Garrett and his broken wagon wheel, about her journey to Virginia City and her sister Margaret. Yates listened without interrupting, but she could feel the tension in his body as she spoke, a coiled anger that made her nervous. "That son of a bitch left you to die," Yates said flatly when she finished. "Samuel Garrett, you said. I know him. He comes through Pahrump every few months with his wagon. Next time I see him, we are going to have words." "Pahrump?" Tabitha asked. "Small town about 30 miles south of here, down in the valley. That is where I am based out of, though I spend most of my time up in these mountains. I run cattle in the summer and trap in the winter." He adjusted his grip on her as the horse navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "My cabin is not much, but it has a fireplace and supplies. We will get you warmed up and fed, and then we can figure out what to do next." Tabitha wanted to stay awake, to see where they were going, but the combination of exhaustion, cold, and the rhythmic movement of the horse was too much. Her eyes drifted closed, and she felt herself sinking into the warmth of Yates Ryland's embrace, trusting this stranger with her life because she had no other choice. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic flared in her chest. Then memory returned, and she opened her eyes to find herself lying on a narrow bed in a small cabin, covered with so many blankets she could barely move. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, filling the single room with warmth and light. Yates Ryland stood at a small table near the fire, stirring something in a pot. "You are awake," he said, turning to look at her. In the firelight she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark brown hair that brushed his collar and a few days' worth of stubble on his jaw. His eyes were kind despite the hardness of his features, and when he smiled, it softened his whole face. "How are you feeling?" "Warm," Tabitha said, and was surprised to find tears running down her cheeks. "I am so warm, thank you. Do not thank me yet. You are not out of the woods, so to speak." He ladled something from the pot into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this. It is just broth, but it will help." Tabitha struggled to sit up, and Yates set the cup down to help her, propping pillows behind her back. His hands were gentle despite their size and obvious strength. When she was settled, he handed her the cup, and she sipped gratefully. The broth was rich and salty, warming her from the inside out. "Your boots were ruined," Yates said, returning to the fire. "And your dress was soaked through. I hung everything by the fire to dry, and I gave you one of my shirts to wear. I hope that is all right. I tried to be respectful." Tabitha looked down and realized she was indeed wearing a man's shirt, several sizes too large for her. Under the blankets, she could feel that she was still wearing her undergarments. A flush crept up her cheeks, but she forced it down. Propriety seemed like a luxury she could not afford given the circumstances. "Thank you. I appreciate your discretion." They fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside the cabin. Tabitha drank her broth and studied the cabin while Yates busied himself with cooking. It was small but well maintained, with a single room that served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove for cooking, shelves lined with supplies, and various tools and equipment hanging from hooks on the walls. Through a small window, she could see snow falling heavily, erasing the world in white. "The storm is getting worse," Yates said, following her gaze. "We will be snowed in for at least a few days. I hope that does not trouble you." "Given the alternative was freezing to death on a mountain trail, I think I can manage," Tabitha said, attempting humor despite the strangeness of the situation. Yates chuckled, a low sound that warmed something inside her that had nothing to do with the fire or the broth. Fair point. Are you hungry? I have venison stew, and I can make biscuits if you want something more substantial. Whatever you are having would be wonderful, Tabitha said. She finished her broth and set the cup aside, pulling the blankets more tightly around herself. I do not want to be any more trouble than I have already been. You are not trouble, Yates said firmly. He looked at her, his whiskey-colored eyes serious. What happened to you was not your fault. Samuel Garrett is a coward and a fool, and you are alive despite him, not because of him. You are welcome here for as long as you need. The sincerity in his voice made Tabitha's throat tight with emotion. She had been so alone for so long, first after losing her teaching position, then on the terrible journey with Samuel Garrett. To have someone show her such kindness, such care, felt almost overwhelming. Thank you, she managed. Truly, thank you. They ate together as the storm raged outside, Yates sitting on the edge of the bed since there was only one chair and he insisted Tabitha should stay under the blankets. The venison stew was delicious, rich and hearty, and the biscuits were surprisingly good for having been made by a bachelor cowboy in a mountain cabin. They talked as they ate, carefully at first, then with growing ease. Tabitha learned that Yates had been born in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers. His family had moved west when he was 15, settling in California before the war. He had served with the Union cavalry, and after the war ended, he had drifted for a while before settling in Nevada. He had been running cattle and trapping in these mountains for the past 5 years, living alone except for occasional trips into Pahrump for supplies. In turn, Tabitha told him about her life in San Francisco, about teaching children who looked at her with bright, eager eyes, hungry for knowledge. She told him about losing her position, about the letter from her sister Margaret, about the hope she had carried that Virginia City would be a fresh start. It still can be, Yates said when she finished. Once the storm clears, I will take you there myself. I know the trails and I can get you to your sister safely. I cannot ask you to do that, Tabitha protested. You have already done so much. You are not asking, I am offering. His tone left no room for argument. Besides, I need to go into Virginia City anyway to sell some furs. It is no trouble to have company on the journey. They fell quiet again, but it was a comfortable silence this time, the kind that exists between people who are growing used to each other's presence. Tabitha felt her eyes growing heavy, the warmth and food and safety conspiring to pull her back toward sleep. You should rest, Yates said, taking her empty bowl. Your body needs time to recover from the cold. I will take the floor tonight. I cannot take your bed, Tabitha protested, but Yates was already gathering blankets and making a pallet near the fire. The bed is yours for as long as you need it, he said. I have slept on harder surfaces, believe me. Now close your eyes and rest. Tabitha wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a tide. She slid back down under the blankets, her body sinking into the mattress. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Yates Ryland sitting by the fire, his profile outlined in gold, keeping watch while the storm raged outside. She woke several times during the night, disoriented and confused, her body aching from the ordeal on the trail. Each time she found Yates awake, tending the fire or checking the window, making sure the cabin stayed warm and secure. Once she woke shivering despite the blankets, her body remembering the cold, and Yates was there immediately, adding another blanket, speaking in low, soothing tones until she calmed. You are safe, he murmured, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. I promise you, you are safe. Tabitha believed him. Morning came gray and cold, the the storm still howling outside. Tabitha woke to find Yates already up making coffee on the stove. The smell was heavenly, rich and dark, cutting through the wood smoke. She sat up slowly, testing her body. Everything ached, but it was a distant ache, manageable. The immediate crisis had passed. "Good morning," Yates said, glancing over his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" "Much better," Tabitha said honestly. "Sore, but better." "Good. That is good." He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to her. "Your dress is dry, and I patched your boots as best I could. They will not win any prizes, but they will keep your feet warm and dry." Tabitha took the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin cup. "You did not have to do that." "I wanted to," Yates said simply. He settled into the chair by the table, his own cup cradled in his large hands. "Besides, we will be stuck here together for at least another day or two. Might as well make sure you are comfortable." The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The storm continued unabated, piling snow against the cabin walls, sealing them away from the world. Tabitha and Yates fell into an easy routine, cooking together, talking by the fire, playing cards with a worn deck Yates produced from a trunk. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the profound to the mundane. Tabitha learned that Yates loved to read, that the trunk under his bed was full of books he had collected over the years. He lent her a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, and she spent an afternoon reading while he repaired a saddle, the silence between them comfortable and companionable. Yates learned that Tabitha could sing, that she had a clear, sweet voice that filled the cabin with beauty. She sang old folk songs her mother had taught her, and she watched Yates's face soften as he listened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. They learned each other's habits and quirks. Yates took his coffee black and strong, and he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. Tabitha liked honey in her coffee when it was available, and she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on something. Yates was an early riser, awake before dawn to tend the fire. Tabitha liked to stay up late, reading by firelight long after dinner was finished. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. Tabitha woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through the cabin window, turning the snow-covered world outside into a landscape of diamonds. Yates was already outside, clearing a path from the cabin door, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Tabitha dressed quickly in her now dry clothes, lacing up her patched boots, and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical thing, but it lacked the killing edge it had possessed on the trail. She was warm and fed and rested, and the sun on her face felt like a benediction. "It is beautiful," she said, joining Yates in the cleared space before the cabin. "It is," he agreed, leaning on his shovel. He looked at her, and something in his expression made Tabitha's breath catch. "We can leave tomorrow if the weather holds." The trail down to Pahrump should be passable by then. "Tomorrow," Tabitha repeated, and was surprised to find she felt no joy at the prospect. These 3 days in the cabin with Yates had been strange and unexpected, but they had also been peaceful in a way she had not experienced in a long time. The thought of leaving, of continuing on to Virginia City and her sister, and the uncertain future that awaited her there, filled her with a hollow feeling she could not quite name. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey, Yates checking his horse's shoes and packing supplies while Tabitha helped as much as she could. That evening they sat together by the fire one last time, and the silence between them was heavy with things unsaid. "I am going to miss this," Tabitha said finally, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I know that must sound strange, given the circumstances, but these past few days have been peaceful. I have not felt this content in a long time." Yates was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "It has not been strange for me either. Having you here, it has been good. The cabin feels less empty." Tabitha's heart was beating too fast, her palms damp. She knew she should stay silent, should let the moment pass, but something in her refused. She had nearly died on that frozen trail, and the experience had stripped away her patience for propriety and pretense. "I do not want to leave," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know I have to. I know I need to get to Virginia City and my sister, but I do not want to leave you." Yates turned to look at her, and the expression in his whiskey-colored eyes made her pulse race. "Tabitha," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I have been alone for 5 years. I thought I preferred it that way, thought I was better off without anyone to worry about or disappoint. But these past 3 days with you, I have realized how wrong I was. I do not want you to leave either." "Then what do we do?" Tabitha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yates reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she did not, he cupped her face in his hand, his palm warm and rough against her cheek. "I do not have much to offer," he said. "A cabin in the mountains, a simple life. But if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to see where this could go between us, I would count myself the luckiest man in Nevada." Tabitha felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "What about my sister? What about Virginia City?" "We will go to Virginia City," Yates said. "We will find your sister and tell her you are safe. And then, if you still want to, we will figure out the rest together." Tabitha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Yates leaned forward, moving slowly, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost tentative, a question more than a demand. Tabitha answered by kissing him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself to this moment, to this man who had saved her life and was now offering her something even more precious, a future. They left the next morning, Tabitha riding behind Yates on his roan horse, her arms wrapped around his waist. The journey down from the mountains was treacherous, the trail slick with ice and snow, but Yates navigated it with the ease of long practice. They stopped several times to rest the horse and eat from the supplies Yates had packed, and each time they stopped, Yates would check on Tabitha, making sure she was warm enough, comfortable enough, safe enough. Pahrump appeared in the valley below them as the sun was beginning to set, a small collection of buildings clustered around a main street. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Tabitha could see people moving about even in the fading light. It looked like civilization, like safety, and yet she found herself reluctant to arrive, to leave the private world she and Yates had inhabited for the past few days. "We will stay at the boarding house tonight," Yates said as they rode down into town. "Get you a proper room and a hot meal. Then tomorrow we will continue on to Virginia City." The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to Nevada during the gold rush and stayed after her husband died. She took one look at Tabitha's worn appearance and Yates's protective stance and nodded knowingly, leading them to 2 rooms side by side on the 2nd floor. "Bath water will be ready in an hour," Mrs. Chen said. "And dinner is at 7. You look like you could both use a good meal." Tabitha thanked her and retreated to her room, closing the door and leaning against it. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the main street. After days in the cabin and hours on the trail, it felt impossibly luxurious. She stripped off her clothes and washed as best she could with the pitcher of water Mrs. Chen had left, scrubbing away days of grime and fear. When she emerged an hour later, bathed and dressed in her now clean dress, she found Yates waiting in the hallway. He had shaved and changed his shirt, and the transformation was striking. He was a handsome man, she realized, the kind of handsome that came from strength and character rather than perfect features. "You look beautiful," Yates said, and the sincerity in his voice made Tabitha blush. "You clean up rather well yourself," she replied, and was rewarded with one of his rare smiles. Dinner was a lively affair, the boarding house dining room filled with travelers and townspeople. Mrs. Chen served roasted chicken and vegetables and fresh bread, and Tabitha ate until she thought she might burst. Yates sat across from her, and their feet touched under the table, a small point of contact that felt charged with meaning. After dinner, Yates walked her back to her room. They stood in the hallway, neither wanting to say good night, the moment stretching between them. "Tomorrow we will find your sister," Yates said finally, "and then we will figure everything else out." "Tomorrow," Tabitha agreed. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Thank you, Yates, for everything." "You do not need to thank me," he said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the gesture old-fashioned and courtly. "Good night, Tabitha." "Good night," she whispered and forced herself to step into her room and close the door between them. She lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Everything had changed so quickly. A week ago, she had been a desperate woman traveling with a stranger, hoping for a new life in Virginia City. Now she was a woman in love, contemplating a future she had never imagined. The speed of it should have frightened her, but instead she felt only certainty. Yates Ryland was a good man, an honest man, and what she felt for him was real and solid and true. They set out for Virginia City early the next morning, the journey taking most of the day. The town, when they finally reached it, was everything Tabitha had imagined and more. Built on the slopes of Mount Davidson, Virginia City was a bustling metropolis by Nevada standards, its streets crowded with miners and merchants and families. The wealth from the Comstock lode was evident everywhere, in the grand buildings and busy saloons and well-dressed people hurrying about their business. Finding Margaret was easier than Tabitha had expected. They asked at the general store, and the proprietor knew exactly who they meant. Margaret Turner worked as a seamstress for one of the town's dressmakers, and she lived in a small house on the north edge of town with two other unmarried women. Tabitha's hands were shaking as Yates helped her down from the horse in front of the house. It had been 2 years since she had last seen her sister. 2 years of letters and longing, and the slow drift that came when family was separated by distance and circumstance. She knocked on the door, and when it opened, Margaret stood there, older than Tabitha remembered but still recognizably her sister. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Margaret let out a cry and threw her arms around Tabitha, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I thought you were dead," Margaret sobbed into Tabitha's shoulder. "Samuel Garrett came through town a week ago and said his wagon broke down and you decided to continue on foot. I thought you had frozen to death in the mountains." "I nearly did," Tabitha admitted, returning her sister's embrace. "But Yates found me. He saved my life." Margaret pulled back and noticed Yates for the first time standing quietly beside the horse. Her eyes widened, taking in his height and his weathered face and the quiet strength that radiated from him. "You must be Yates," she said. "Please come inside. Both of you." The house was small but cozy, shared by Margaret and 2 other women who worked in town. They made tea and Tabitha told the whole story, from Samuel Garrett's betrayal to freezing on the trail to Yates finding her and taking her to his cabin. She left out some details, the growing feelings between her and Yates, the kiss by the fire, but Margaret was perceptive. She kept glancing between Tabitha and Yates, noting the way they sat close together, the way their eyes met and held. "So what now?" Margaret asked when Tabitha finished. "You are welcome to stay here, of course. There is a teaching position available at the schoolhouse. The pay is not much, but it is steady." Tabitha looked at Yates, and he looked back at her, the question plain in his eyes. This was her decision, her choice to make. She thought about the cabin in the mountains, about the peaceful days by the fire, about the feeling of Yates's arms around her as they rode through the snow. She thought about the loneliness she had felt in San Francisco, the constant sense that she was waiting for her real life to begin. "I think," Tabitha said slowly, "that I would like to go back to Pahrump with Yates, if the offer is still open." Yates's face lit up with a smile that transformed his whole appearance. "The offer is very much still open," he said. Margaret looked surprised but not displeased. She studied Yates carefully, taking his measure, and whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded. "He is a good man," she said to Tabitha. "I can see that, but are you sure? You have only known him a few days." "I am sure," Tabitha said, and realized it was true. She had never been more sure of anything in her life. "I love him, Margaret. I know it is fast and strange, but I love him, and I want to see where this can go." "Then I am happy for you," Margaret said, reaching out to squeeze Tabitha's hand. "But promise me you will write and visit when you can." "I promise," Tabitha said, tears streaming down her cheeks. They stayed in Virginia City for 2 more days, giving Tabitha time to reconnect with her sister and for Yates to sell his furs. On the morning they were set to leave, Margaret pressed a bundle into Tabitha's hands. "Something to help you start your new life," Margaret said. Inside the bundle was a beautiful quilt, hand-stitched with care, and a dress Margaret had made herself, far finer than anything Tabitha currently owned. "Thank you," Tabitha whispered, hugging her sister one more time. "For everything." The journey back to Pahrump was different from the journey out. They rode slowly, talking and laughing, stopping to admire views and share meals. Yates told Tabitha about his plans for the ranch, about the cattle he wanted to raise and the improvements he wanted to make to the cabin. Tabitha told him about her dreams of teaching, about the books she wanted to read, and the garden she wanted to plant come spring. When they finally reached Pahrump, Yates did not take her directly to the cabin. Instead, he stopped at the small church on the edge of town, where a circuit preacher happened to be staying. "Marry me," Yates said, helping Tabitha down from the horse. "Right now, today, I do not want to wait any more. I want you to be my wife." Tabitha felt like her heart might burst from joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The ceremony was simple, performed by the traveling preacher with Mrs. Chen and her husband as witnesses. Tabitha wore the dress Margaret had made, and Yates wore his best shirt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her with a tenderness that made her weak in the knees. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, Mrs. Chen having prepared her finest room for them. Tabitha was nervous, her limited knowledge of marital intimacy coming mostly from vague warnings and whispered conversations. But Yates was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable and willing every step of the way. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Tabitha's head resting on Yates's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered into the darkness. "Neither did I," Yates replied, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "You have changed everything for me, Tabitha. My whole world is different now. Better, I hope," she said. "So much better," he confirmed, kissing the top of her head. They moved back to the cabin the next day, and Tabitha began the work of turning the simple structure into a home. She hung curtains she sewed from fabric Mrs. Chen gave her. She arranged the books on shelves and added wildflowers in jars when the spring finally came. She planted a garden behind the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil, and she started teaching the children of the few families who lived in the area, holding classes at the cabin twice a week. Yates proved to be everything Tabitha could have hoped for in a husband. He was hardworking and honest, rising before dawn to tend the cattle and horses he was slowly accumulating. He was patient with her as she learned the rhythms of mountain life, teaching her to ride and shoot and navigate the trails. And he was affectionate, never letting a day pass without telling her he loved her, without kissing her good morning and good night. Their first year together was not without challenges. The isolation of the cabin wore on Tabitha sometimes, used as she was to the bustle of San Francisco. The work was hard and constant, from hauling water to chopping wood to preserving food for the winter. And there were moments of fear, like when Yates was thrown from a horse and broke his arm, or when a late spring snowstorm trapped them in the cabin for a week. But through it all, their love deepened and grew. They learned to work together, to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate without words. Tabitha learned that Yates had nightmares sometimes, remnants of his time in the war, and she learned how to soothe him, holding him until the demons passed. Yates learned that Tabitha needed time alone with her books and her thoughts, and he learned to give her that space without taking offense. In the summer of 1876, Tabitha realized she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and the joy on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he kept saying, over and over, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy was difficult, especially in the isolated cabin. Tabitha suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, the simple tasks of daily life became increasingly challenging. Yates was constantly worried, fussing over her in a way that was both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Tabitha would remind him when he tried to prevent her from doing her normal chores. "I know," Yates would reply. "But you are carrying my child, the most precious thing in the world to me. Let me take care of you." When her time came in March of 1877, Yates rode through a late-season snowstorm to bring Mrs. Chen from Pahrump to help with the delivery. The labor was long and painful, lasting through the night and into the next day. Yates paced outside the cabin, unable to stand being apart from Tabitha but unable to bear watching her in pain. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, a baby's cry pierced the air. Mrs. Chen emerged from the cabin, her face weary but smiling. "You have a son," she told Yates. "A healthy, strong son, and your wife is well." Yates rushed inside to find Tabitha propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up as he entered, and the smile on her face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Meet your son," she said softly. Yates approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Tabitha's nose, and Yates felt something in his chest crack open, a well of love so deep he thought he might drown in it. "He is perfect," Yates whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking William," Tabitha said. "William Ryland, we can call him Will." "William," Yates repeated, trying it out. "I like it. Hello, Will. Welcome to the world." The baby made a small sound, and Yates laughed, a sound of pure joy. He leaned down to kiss Tabitha, careful not to disturb the baby. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for this gift, for this life. I love you so much." "I love you too," Tabitha replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "More than I ever thought possible." Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Will was a good baby overall, but he was still a baby, with all the crying and feeding and changing that entailed. Tabitha and Yates took turns walking him when he was fussy, singing to him, rocking him to sleep. They marveled at every milestone, his first smile, his first laugh, the first time he rolled over. As Will grew, the cabin began to feel smaller. Yates started making plans to expand, adding another room that could serve as a bedroom for Will and any future children. He worked on the addition whenever he had time, sawing and hammering while Tabitha cared for Will and maintained the household. Margaret visited when Will was 6 months old, making the journey from Virginia City with her new husband, a mining engineer named Robert. She was enchanted by her nephew, holding him for hours and making silly faces to elicit his gummy smiles. "You look happy," Margaret told Tabitha one afternoon while the men were outside working on the addition. "Truly happy." "I am," Tabitha confirmed, watching Will sleep in his cradle. "I never imagined my life would turn out this way, but I would not change a single thing." "Not even nearly freezing to death on a mountain trail?" Margaret asked with a wry smile. Tabitha laughed. "Well, I could have done without that part, but if it had not happened, I never would have met Yates. So in a strange way, I am grateful even for that." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Will grew from a baby into a toddler, then into a little boy with his father's whiskey-colored eyes and his mother's quick mind. Tabitha gave birth to a daughter when Will was 3, a tiny girl they named Sarah who had Tabitha's blonde hair and Yates's stubborn determination. 2 years after Sarah came another son, Thomas, who was quieter than his siblings but no less loved. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, eventually becoming a proper house with 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and even a parlor where Tabitha could hold her classes. Yates's cattle operation grew as well, and he hired on a few hands to help with the work. The family was not wealthy, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. Yates proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful with the children. He taught Will to ride and rope, and he was teaching Sarah as well despite the raised eyebrows it drew from some of the more traditional families in the area. He read to the children every night, settling them in bed and spinning tales of adventure and courage. Tabitha thrived in her role as mother and teacher, educating not just her own children but a growing number of students from the surrounding area. Her little school became known for its excellence, and families began moving to the area specifically so their children could attend. She was proud of this, proud of the difference she was making in these young lives. Samuel Garrett came through Pahrump one day in the autumn of 1880. Yates was in town picking up supplies when he saw the familiar wagon rolling down the main street. The rage that filled him was immediate and visceral. The memory of finding Tabitha frozen and desperate on that mountain trail still fresh despite the years that had passed. He walked up to the wagon as Samuel was tying off the reins, and the merchant looked up with a friendly smile that died when he saw Yates's expression. "You left my wife to die," Yates said, his voice flat and cold. "5 years ago, you left Tabitha Turner on a mountain trail in the middle of a snowstorm, and you rode away." Samuel Garrett went pale, recognition and guilt warring on his face. "I did not know she was your wife," he stammered, "and I did not leave her to die. I thought she would make it to the next town." "You thought wrong," Yates said. "She nearly froze to death. If I had not found her, she would have died and our children would never have been born. You would have been responsible for ending 4 lives." "I am sorry," Samuel said, and he did sound genuinely remorseful. "Truly, I am sorry. It was a cowardly thing to do, and I have regretted it ever since." Yates studied him for a long moment, and slowly the rage began to drain away. Tabitha was alive and well. They had 3 beautiful children and a good life. Holding on to anger at this pathetic man would accomplish nothing. "Stay away from my family," Yates said finally, "and if you ever abandon another woman in the wilderness, You will answer to more than just harsh words." "I understand," Samuel said. And again, "I am sorry." Yates turned and walked away, and when he returned home that evening and told Tabitha about the encounter, she held him close and told him she was proud of him for choosing mercy over vengeance. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays and the changing seasons. Will grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with dreams of starting his own ranch. Sarah proved to be as good with horses as any man, and she began helping Yates train the new colts. Thomas loved books as much as his mother, and Tabitha began teaching him Latin and Greek, preparing him for a future that might take him beyond the mountains. In 1885, when Tabitha was 32 and Yates was 40, she gave birth to their fourth child, another daughter they named Emma. The birth was harder than the others, and the doctor they brought in from Virginia City told them gently that there should be no more children. Tabitha wept when he delivered the news, grieving for the babies she would never have, but Yates held her and reminded her of the 4 miracles they had already been blessed with. "We have been given so much," he said, stroking her hair as she cried. "More than I ever dreamed was possible. 4 healthy children, a home we built together, a love that has only grown stronger with time. We have been blessed, Tabitha." "I know," she whispered. "I know we have. I am just sad it has to end." "Nothing is ending," Yates corrected gently. "We are just entering a new chapter." He was right, as he so often was. As the children grew older and more independent, Tabitha and Yates found themselves with more time for each other again. They took long rides through the mountains, just the two of them, reconnecting with the early days of their marriage. They stayed up late talking by the fire, sharing dreams and memories and hopes for the future. Will married when he was 21, taking a wife from one of the neighboring ranches. Sarah shocked everyone by announcing she planned to become a veterinarian, and she left for California to study at a new veterinary college that accepted women. Thomas won a scholarship to a university in the East, and he departed with tears and promises to write often. Emma was still young, only 8, and she was the light of her parents' lives, keeping the house lively with her laughter and questions. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yates took Tabitha back to the spot on the trail where he had found her. They rode up into the mountains in early January, retracing the path of that fateful day. When they reached the place where Tabitha had collapsed in the snow, Yates helped her down from her horse and pulled her into his arms. "20 years ago I found you here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You were freezing and desperate, and I asked you to ride with me where it was warm. I had no idea that simple offer would change my entire life." "I was so scared," Tabitha remembered, looking around at the now familiar landscape. "I thought I was going to die alone on this mountain, and then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even finished praying." "I love you," Yates said, cupping her face in his hands. "I have loved you from that very first day, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Tabitha replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "Thank you for saving me, Yates, for saving me and giving me this beautiful life." They stood there for a long time, holding each other on the frozen trail where their story had begun, while the wind whispered through the pines and the winter sun painted the snow gold. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges but also joys and triumphs. Will gave them their first grandchild, a boy they named after Yates. Sarah returned from California as a certified veterinarian, one of the first women in Nevada to hold such a distinction, and she set up practice in Pahrump. Thomas sent long letters from the East, describing his studies and the girl he was courting. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's love of teaching and her father's practical wisdom. Yates and Tabitha aged together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with the marks of a life well lived. The ranch prospered under their stewardship, growing into one of the most respected operations in the region. Their home was always filled with family, with grandchildren running through the rooms and friends gathering for meals and celebrations. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch they had built together, watching the sun set over the mountains, and they would hold hands and marvel at the life they had created. Every challenge they had faced, every obstacle they had overcome, had been worth it for this. The peace of being together, the contentment of a love that had weathered every storm. "Do you remember," Tabitha asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, "when you said your cabin felt less empty with me there?" "I remember," Yates confirmed, squeezing her hand. "My whole life feels less empty with you," Tabitha said. "You filled all the hollow places I did not even know I had. You made me complete." "The feeling is mutual," Yates said, bringing her hand to his lips. "You are my heart, Tabitha. Everything good in my life comes back to you." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The night was cold, but they were warm, surrounded by the love they had nurtured for decades, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Inside the house, they could hear Emma playing the piano, the notes drifting out through the open window. Their grandchildren were visiting, staying for the week, and the house was full of laughter and chaos and love. This was their legacy, Yates and Tabitha realized. Not just the ranch or the house or the money they would leave behind, but the family they had created, the love they had modeled, the example they had set of what a true partnership could be. Will had grown into a fine rancher, managing his own spread successfully while still helping his father with the family operation. He and his wife had given Yates and Tabitha 5 grandchildren so far, and there was talk of a 6th on the way. Will often said he wanted a marriage like his parents, a love that grew stronger with time rather than fading. Sarah had become a respected member of the community, her veterinary skills in high demand throughout the region. She had married a few years back, a quiet teacher who supported her ambitions and loved her fierce independence. They had no children yet, but Sarah said they were considering it, and Tabitha hoped she would live to see those grandchildren born. Thomas had stayed in the East, becoming a professor at the same university where he had studied. He had married his sweetheart, a brilliant woman who shared his love of literature and philosophy. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they made the long journey west every other year to visit. Their letters were frequent and full of affection, keeping Yates and Tabitha connected to that part of their family despite the distance. Emma, their youngest, showed no signs of settling down, much to the consternation of several young men in the area. She was 26 now, teaching at the school Tabitha had founded, and she seemed perfectly content with her life. "I am waiting for a love like yours and Papa's," she told Tabitha once. "I will not settle for anything less." "You should not," Tabitha agreed. "Love is worth waiting for." The seasons continued their endless cycle, and Yates and Tabitha moved through them with the grace of long practice. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th. Their grandchildren grew, some of them having children of their own, making Yates and Tabitha great-grandparents. The title made them laugh, though they wore it with pride. The cabin that had once been a simple structure for a bachelor cowboy had been transformed into a true homestead, the heart of a thriving family. Additions had been built on over the years, and the house now sprawled comfortably, with room for everyone to gather. The barn that Yates had built held some of the finest horses in Nevada, trained with the same patience and care he brought to everything he did. On their 35th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the house, spilling out onto the porches and into the yard. There was food and music and dancing, and at the center of it all were Yates and Tabitha, their hands clasped together, their eyes only for each other. "Make a speech," Will called out, and soon the whole family was chanting for them to say something. Yates looked at Tabitha and she nodded, encouraging him. He stood, and the crowd fell silent, all eyes on the tall man with silver hair and whiskey-colored eyes who had built this legacy. 35 years ago, Yates began, his voice still strong despite his age, I found a woman freezing on a mountain trail. I offered her warmth and shelter, never imagining that she would become my entire world. Tabitha, you have been my partner, my love, my greatest adventure. Everything good in my life exists because you said yes when I asked you to ride with me. He looked out at the assembled family, at the faces of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This is what we built together, he continued. Not just a house or a ranch, but a family. A legacy of love and hard work and commitment. I hope all of you will carry that forward, will build your own legacies with the same care and dedication that your grandmother and I have tried to model. Tabitha stood and took Yates's hand, her own eyes misty with tears. I was lost when Yates found me, she said, her voice clear and strong. Lost in more ways than just physically. I had no direction, no purpose, no real home. And this man, this beautiful, kind, strong man, gave me all of that. He gave me a home, a family, a life beyond my wildest dreams. She looked at Yates, and the love in her eyes was so intense it made several of the grandchildren tear up. Thank you, she said simply. For 35 years of love. For these 4 beautiful children and all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren they have given us. For every morning I have woken up in your arms, and every night I have fallen asleep hearing your heartbeat. You are my everything, Yates Ryland, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. The applause was thunderous, and soon the celebration was in full swing again. But Yates and Tabitha slipped away from the crowd, walking hand in hand to the spot behind the house where they had planted a garden all those years ago. The garden was still there, tended now by Emma, bursting with vegetables and flowers. 35 years, Tabitha mused, leaning her head on Yates's shoulder. It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. The best years of my life, Yates confirmed. Every single one of them. They stood there together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold and purple. From the house, they could hear music and laughter, the sounds of their family celebrating. It was perfect, Tabitha thought. Everything about this moment, about this life, was perfect. The months passed, turning into years. Yates and Tabitha continued to age, their steps growing slower, their bodies less willing to keep up with their still sharp minds. But they remained devoted to each other, their love a constant in a changing world. Emma finally found her love, a young doctor who moved to Pahrump to set up practice. The wedding was a joyous affair, held at the ranch with the whole family in attendance. Tabitha cried happy tears as she watched her youngest daughter marry, grateful that all her children had found good partners and good lives. More great-grandchildren arrived, and the family continued to grow and thrive. The ranch passed to Will officially, though Yates still offered advice and guidance when asked. Tabitha retired from active teaching, though she still tutored students occasionally when they needed extra help. They were in their 70s now, and they knew their time was growing shorter. But rather than fear the end, they embraced each day as a gift. They took walks together every morning, moving slowly but determinedly through the land they had tamed together. They sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. "I am not afraid," Tabitha told Yates one night as they lay in bed together. "When it is time to go, I am not afraid, because I know I will have lived a full and beautiful life." "So will I," Yates agreed, pulling her close. "But I hope we have a few more years yet. I am not ready to leave you." "We will have as long as we are meant to have," Tabitha said. "And when one of us goes, the other will not be far behind. I cannot imagine existing in a world without you." "Nor I you," Yates whispered into her hair. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, just as they had done for nearly 40 years. And when morning came, they woke together and began another day, grateful for the gift of each other's presence. The years continued to pass, and Yates and Tabitha remained inseparable. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by family, a gathering even larger than the one for their 35th. There were now so many grandchildren and great-grandchildren that Tabitha had taken to keeping a book with all their names and birthdays, afraid she might forget someone. "We did good," Yates said to her that night after everyone had gone home and they were alone again. "Look at what we created, Tabitha. Look at the legacy we are leaving." "We did very good," Tabitha agreed, her voice full of satisfaction and pride. They were both 80 now, their bodies frail but their spirits strong. They moved through their days with the ease of long practice, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with looks and gestures as much as words. They were two halves of a whole, and everyone who saw them together could feel the power of their bond. On a cold January morning, 42 years after Yates had found Tabitha on that frozen trail, they took one last ride up into the mountains together. It was Emma who saddled the horses, worried about her parents but understanding their need to make this journey. They rode slowly, carefully, following the familiar trails. When they reached the spot where their story had begun, they stopped and dismounted. The trail looked much the same as it had all those years ago, though they themselves had changed beyond recognition. They were old now, their hair white, their faces lined with decades of living. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people they had been on that day so long ago. A desperate woman seeking help, and a lonely man looking for purpose. "Thank you," Tabitha said, taking Yates's hands in hers. "For stopping that day, for seeing me, for offering me warmth and shelter and eventually love. You changed my life, Yates Ryland." "You changed mine," Yates replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I was existing before you, but I was not really living. You taught me what it meant to truly live, to love, to build something beautiful." They kissed there on the frozen trail, a kiss that held 42 years of love and devotion and partnership. When they finally pulled apart, they were both crying tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Ready to go home?" Yates asked. "Always," Tabitha replied. "As long as I am with you, I am home." They rode back down the mountain together, and when they reached the ranch, their family was waiting. There was a big dinner planned, a celebration of another year together. Tabitha and Yates moved through the evening surrounded by love, by the tangible evidence of the life they had built. That night, lying in bed, Tabitha felt a deep contentment settle over her. She had lived a good life, a full life. She had loved and been loved, had raised children and watched them flourish, had built a home and a legacy. She had been blessed beyond measure, and it all traced back to that day on the frozen trail when a cowboy had seen her shivering and said, "Ride with me where it is warm." "I love you," she whispered to Yates in the darkness. "I love you too," he whispered back, "forever and always." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and their family found them that way the next morning, peaceful and still, having passed together in the night. It was exactly as they would have wanted it, together to the very end, neither having to face a world without the other. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, families from all over the region coming to pay their respects to two people who had touched so many lives. Will gave a eulogy that had everyone in tears, speaking of his parents' love and devotion, their kindness and generosity, the example they had set for all who knew them. They were buried on the ranch, under a pair of oak trees they had planted together years ago. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates in a single line, "Together always." The ranch continued under Will's stewardship, and the family continued to gather there for holidays and celebrations. The house was maintained with care, preserved as a testament to what Yates and Tabitha had built. Their story was passed down through the generations, told and retold, a reminder of the power of love and the importance of choosing the right partner. Emma eventually wrote a book about her parents, documenting their story for future generations. It was published to great acclaim, and people all over the country were moved by the tale of the cowboy who found a freezing woman on a trail and offered her warmth, only to discover he had found his soulmate. Years later, one of Yates and Tabitha's great-great-grandchildren stood on the trail where the story had begun, reading from Emma's book to her own children. "And that is how our family started," she told them. With an act of kindness on a frozen trail, with a man who saw someone in need and helped them, and with a love that lasted a lifetime. The children looked around at the winter landscape, trying to imagine their ancestors meeting there so long ago. It seemed almost like a fairy tale, too perfect to be real. But the evidence was all around them, in the family resemblance they all shared, in the ranch that still stood in the valley below, in the love that had been passed down through the generations like a precious heirloom. "Will we find love like that?" one of the children asked. "If you are lucky and you are patient and you are open to it," their mother replied. Great-great-grandma Tabitha used to say that love finds you when you need it most. She was lost on that trail and great-great-grandpa Yates found her. It was meant to be. They stood there for a few more minutes, paying silent tribute to the ancestors who had started it all. Then they mounted their horses and rode back down to the ranch, where the rest of the family was gathering for another celebration, another chance to honor the legacy that Yates and Tabitha had left behind. The ranch thrived for generations, always staying in the family, always maintained with the same care and dedication that Yates and Tabitha had brought to it. The house was expanded again and again to accommodate new generations, but the original cabin remained at its heart, preserved exactly as it had been, a reminder of humble beginnings and the power of love to transform everything. The school that Tabitha had started continued as well, growing into a full academy that educated children from all over the region. A scholarship was established in her name, helping young women pursue education and teaching careers. Sarah's veterinary practice was taken over by one of her nieces, keeping that legacy alive as well. But the greatest legacy was the love itself, the model that Yates and Tabitha had provided of what a true partnership could be. Their children all had strong marriages, and their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. The pattern repeated itself through the generations, this understanding that love was work and commitment and choice, that it required both partners to show up fully every day, that it was worth fighting for and nurturing and protecting. On what would have been Yates and Tabitha's 100th anniversary, had they lived, the family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. Hundreds of descendants attended, filling the house and the yard and spilling out into the fields. They raised toasts to the couple who had started it all, sharing stories and memories passed down through the years. Will's grandson, now running the ranch, stood to address the crowd. "We are all here because of a moment of kindness on a frozen trail," he said. "Because a man named Yates Ryland saw a woman in need and stopped to help. Because a woman named Tabitha Turner was brave enough to accept that help and to see where it might lead. They built this ranch, this family, this legacy of love, and we are all responsible for carrying it forward." The crowd erupted in applause, and then someone started singing, an old folk song that Tabitha had loved. Soon everyone joined in, their voices rising into the Nevada sky, a hymn of gratitude and love and family. As the sun set that evening, painting the mountains in gold and purple, several family members made the ride up to the trail where it had all begun. They left flowers there, a small memorial to mark the spot where two lives had intersected and changed everything. And as they rode back down to the ranch, they carried with them the knowledge that love was possible, that it could last, that it could transform everything. Because Yates had seen Tabitha shivering on that frozen trail and he had said, "Ride with me where it is warm." And she had said yes. And that simple exchange had created something beautiful and lasting, a love story for the ages, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The story of Yates and Tabitha Ryland became more than just family history. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that kindness could change lives, that love could blossom in the most unlikely circumstances, that two people committed to each other could build something that would outlast them both. And on cold January nights, when the wind howled through the mountains and snow covered the trails, descendants of Yates and Tabitha would gather by the fire in the ranch house and tell the story again. They would speak of the cowboy and the frozen woman, of the cabin in the mountains, of 42 years of love and devotion. And they would remember that it had all started with one simple, generous offer: "Ride with me where it is warm." That warmth had spread from Yates to Tabitha, from them to their children, from their children to grandchildren and great-grandchildren and beyond. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with love, with family, with the bonds that tie people together across time and distance. And so the story lived on, passed from generation to generation, a testament to the enduring power of love and the importance of helping those in need. Yates and Tabitha Ryland had been gone for many years, but their love remained, as real and powerful as it had been on that first day, warming all those who came after them, a flame that would never die.